The way they looked at me that morning told me everything I needed to know. Eyes skipping right over me in the formation line, voices dropping to whispers as I approached. After 15 years in the Army, I'd become an expert at reading the silent signals that said, "We don't believe you belong here. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." Major Eliza Ramsey. That's what my uniform said. That's what my service record confirmed. But to the commanders of the 5th Special Forces Group, I was just another desk jockey with too many opinions and not enough field experience. They didn't know about the classified missions in Kandahar. They hadn't seen the commendations locked away in Pentagon files. They only saw a female officer assigned to their tactical planning team as some kind of administrative requirement, a box to check off, before they could get back to their real work. I stood at the edge of the briefing room at Fort Campbell, watching as Lieutenant Colonel Jackson distributed the morning's assignments. He called out names with practiced efficiency, each officer stepping forward to receive their orders. When he reached the end of his clipboard, my name hadn't been mentioned. "Sir," I said, voice steady despite the heat rising in my cheeks, "you didn't assign me to a team." The room went quiet, that particular stillness that happens when someone points out an uncomfortable truth. Jackson glanced up, his expression a careful blend of surprise and dismissal. "Major Ramsey," he said, drawing out my name like he was just remembering I existed. "You'll be assisting with communications oversight today. Captain Lewis will handle the tactical planning for Operation Ridgeline." Captain Lewis 3 ranks below me, with half my experience. He straightened slightly at the mention of his name, avoiding eye contact as he clutched his folder with obvious satisfaction. The message couldn't have been clearer if Jackson had written it on the whiteboard. "You're here, but you're not really here." I'd seen this playbook before. Women officers, especially those who specialized in tactical intelligence, often found themselves sidelined into support roles regardless of their rank or qualifications. It wasn't the blatant sexism of decades past, it was subtler now, wrapped in polite language about team dynamics and specialized experience. "Communications oversight," I repeated, keeping my tone neutral even as I felt that familiar knot of frustration tightening in my chest. "Copy that, sir." The briefing continued, officers breaking into their assigned groups, conversation returning to normal volume. I moved to my designated station, a corner desk positioned so far from the main planning table that I'd need binoculars to read the tactical maps. As I settled in, I noticed a few sidelong glances, some sympathetic, others satisfied. The hierarchies within hierarchies were always transparent to those who knew how to read them. Captain Lewis spread his materials across the planning table, immediately dominating the conversation with confidence that bordered on arrogance. "We'll approach from the northern ridge, maintain stealth until the first checkpoint, then execute as practiced." His finger traced a line across the topographical map, officers nodding along with his assessment. I studied the satellite imagery displayed on my monitor, zooming in on the approach route Lewis had just outlined. Something wasn't right. The gradient calculations seemed off, and recent reconnaissance showed defensive positions that didn't appear in the initial briefings. I ran the numbers again, cross-referencing with terrain analysis from previous operations in similar geography. "Captain Lewis," I said, rising from my station with printouts in hand, "I'm noticing some discrepancies in the northern approach. The gradient is steeper than indicated, and these latest images suggest potential observation points along your proposed route." Lewis barely looked up. "Thank you for your input, Major. We've already accounted for the terrain variables." "With respect, sir," I addressed Lieutenant Colonel Jackson instead. "The satellite pass from 0600 shows what appears to be new defensive positions here and here." I pointed to specific coordinates on the map. "If the opposing force has adapted based on our previous patterns, this approach exposes our teams to unnecessary risk." Jackson glanced at the printouts, then at Lewis, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Major Ramsey," Jackson said, his voice taking on that patient tone men often use when they think a woman is overreacting. "Captain Lewis has run similar operations in this terrain before. The tactical assessment has been finalized." The room had gone quiet again, all eyes on this unexpected challenge to the established order. I could feel career momentum slipping away with each second I remained standing there, pushing a point that no one wanted to hear. But 15 years in uniform had taught me that sometimes being respected tomorrow meant being uncomfortable today. "Sir, I've conducted analysis on 14 operations in comparable terrain. The pattern recognition suggests that will be all." "Major," Jackson interrupted, no longer bothering to mask his irritation. "Please return to communications oversight." I returned to my station, aware of the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. I wasn't just being sidelined now, I was becoming a problem. In military culture, there were few positions more precarious than being the officer who didn't know their place. For the next 3 hours, I watched as Operation Ridgeline took shape around assumptions that made my stomach knot with professional concern. The tactical plan relied on outdated intelligence, ignored clear warning signs, and prioritized speed over security in ways that reminded me of missions I'd seen go catastrophically wrong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I documented everything methodically, noting each decision point where caution was abandoned in favor of convenience. Not because I wanted to say, "I told you so" later, but because thorough documentation was sometimes the only shield against the politics that followed failed operations. At 1300 hours, the planning session concluded. Teams dispersed to prepare for the training exercise scheduled to begin at dawn. As I gathered my materials, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson approached my station, his expression unreadable. "A word, Major," he said, gesturing toward a small conference room off the main floor. I followed him inside, maintaining the professional composure that had become second nature, after years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who questioned my presence. Jackson closed the door and turned to face me. "I understand you have concerns about Operation Ridgeline." "Yes, sir." "The intelligence suggests—" He held up a hand to stop me. "Major, I've reviewed your service record. You've spent most of your career in intelligence analysis and tactical planning. But Captain Lewis has been in the field with these teams for the past 3 years. His practical experience outweighs theoretical concerns." The word theoretical landed like a slap. In military parlance, it was code for academic, for untested, for you've never had mud on your boots or blood on your hands, so your opinion holds less weight. It was the classic dismissal used against officers, particularly female officers, whose combat experience was classified or whose expertise wasn't earned through traditional channels. "Sir, with respect, my concerns aren't theoretical. The satellite imagery clearly shows. The decision has been made, Major." His tone was final, brooking no further discussion. "Your role tomorrow will be communications oversight from the command center. Captain Lewis will handle field operations." I maintained eye contact, refusing to be the first to look away. "Understood, sir." As I turned to leave, Jackson added, "And Major? Chain of command exists for a reason. Challenging operational decisions in front of the planning team undermines unit cohesion." The message was clear. Stay in your lane. Don't make waves. Accept your place. I returned to my quarters that evening and reviewed the operation plans again, searching for something I might have missed, some reason why my assessment could be wrong. The more I analyzed, the more certain I became that Operation Ridgeline was walking into a textbook ambush scenario. Military protocol offered limited options. I'd raised my concerns through proper channels and been overruled. Going over Jackson's head would be seen as insubordination, potentially ending any chance of future advancement. Doing nothing meant watching a flawed operation proceed when I knew better. In the end, I made the decision that had defined my entire military career. I chose competence over politics. At 0500, I arrived at the command center 2 hours before the exercise was scheduled to begin. The tactical operations floor hummed with pre-mission preparations. Controller's running system checks on equipment that would monitor every aspect of the training exercise. My assigned station was positioned near the back wall, close enough to observe communications, but far enough from the central command console to reinforce my peripheral role. I powered up my systems and began accessing intelligence feeds that the planning team had either overlooked or dismissed. Weather patterns, updated satellite imagery, and communication intercepts from the opposing force all painted a picture that confirmed my worst fears. The training scenario had been compromised in ways that would turn Captain Lewis's approach route into a tactical nightmare. As personnel filtered in, I continued gathering data, cross-referencing satellite feeds with terrain analysis, building a comprehensive picture of what the teams would actually face versus what they expected to encounter. The discrepancies were significant enough to fundamentally alter any reasonable tactical approach. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson arrived at T-90 minutes, followed by his senior staff and Captain Lewis, who carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never had his judgment questioned. They gathered around the central command console, reviewing final preparations without so much as a glance in my direction. I listened as they conducted their final briefing, noting how little attention was paid to the latest intelligence updates. When Jackson opened the floor for questions, I remained silent. I'd said my piece yesterday and been shut down. Military hierarchy had spoken, and my role was now to observe and document. At T-30 minutes, something unexpected happened. The command center door opened, and a tall figure in dress blues entered without announcement. Conversation died as recognition rippled through the room. Brigadier General Marcus Harrington, commander of Special Operations Task Force East, wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this training exercise. Personnel straightened instinctively as he moved through the room with the quiet authority that comes from decades of command experience. His presence alone changed the atmosphere, transforming a routine training exercise into something that suddenly carried career implications for everyone present. "General Harrington," Jackson said, surprise evident in his voice. "We weren't expecting you this morning." Harrington nodded slightly. "Thought I'd observe today's exercise." "Carry on." He moved to the back of the room, taking a position near my communications station. I maintained focus on my monitors, continuing to track the increasingly troubling intelligence feeds without acknowledging his presence. Years in sensitive positions had taught me that flag officers often watched how you worked when you didn't know you were being observed. As the countdown approached T-15 minutes, I could no longer ignore what the data was telling me. The opposing force had positioned themselves perfectly to intercept Captain Lewis's planned approach route. If this had been an actual combat operation rather than a training exercise, we would be sending soldiers into a carefully prepared trap. Protocol dictated that I relay this information through proper channels, meaning Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, who had already dismissed similar concerns yesterday. Military discipline warred with professional responsibility as I watched the final preparations for an operation that was walking into a disaster. "Major Ramsey," General Harrington's voice was quiet enough that only I could hear it. "You look concerned about something." I turned slightly, meeting his gaze directly. "Sir, the latest intelligence indicates the opposing force has anticipated our approach route." They've positioned observation posts and quick reaction forces in a pattern that suggests they know exactly where Captain Lewis intends to move his teams. Harrington didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved closer to my station, studying the tactical displays with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades reading similar information in places where mistakes cost lives. "Show me," he said simply. I pulled up the satellite imagery, highlighting the defensive positions that had appeared overnight, the communication patterns that indicated coordinated preparation, and the weather data that would further complicate the operation. "And you've brought this to Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's attention?" he asked. "Yesterday, sir." During planning. Harrington's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of something he'd suspected. Without another word, he straightened and walked directly to the central command console where Jackson and Lewis were reviewing final coordination details. "Lieutenant Colonel," Harrington said, his voice carrying easily across the command center. "A moment of your time." The conversation that followed was conducted in tones too low to hear from my position, but the body language told its own story. Jackson's posture stiffening, Lewis glancing repeatedly in my direction, Harrington's steady presence dominating the exchange without visible effort. After several minutes, Harrington turned toward the room at large. "Attention," he said, not raising his voice but somehow commanding complete silence nonetheless. "There's been a change in operational leadership. Major Ramsey will assume tactical command for Operation Ridgeline, effective immediately." The room went completely still. Every eye turned first to Harrington, then to me, then to Jackson, whose face had gone carefully blank in the way of career officers who've just received public correction. "Sir," Jackson said, the single word carrying volumes of confusion and protest. "Major Ramsey has identified critical intelligence that fundamentally alters our tactical approach." Harrington continued as if Jackson hadn't spoken. "Captain Lewis will serve as ground force commander, implementing the revised operational plan under Major Ramsey's direction." He turned toward my station, and I felt the weight of what was happening settle across my shoulders. "Major, please join us at the command console." I gathered my materials with the same methodical precision I'd applied to everything else, aware that every movement was being scrutinized by personnel who'd been dismissing me for days. As I approached the central command position, Captain Lewis stepped aside, his confidence visibly shaken. "General," I acknowledged, my voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through my system. "Request permission to implement immediate changes to the operation plan based on current intelligence." "Granted," Harrington replied. Then, addressing the entire room, "Nobody moves without Major Ramsey's approval. Is that understood?" The chorus of "Yes, sir" that followed contained varying degrees of confusion, resentment, and surprise. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was preventing a flawed operation from proceeding when lives, even in a training scenario, hung in the balance. I turned to the tactical display, acutely conscious of the shift that had just occurred. Yesterday, I'd been the officer nobody wanted to hear from. Today, by direct order of a brigadier general, I was the officer nobody could ignore. "We need to completely revise our approach," I began, voice clear and confident. "The northern route is compromised. We'll redirect to these southern access points, using the weather front moving in as concealment." As I outlined the new operational plan, I could feel resistance giving way to reluctant attention, then to growing engagement as the tactical logic became impossible to dismiss. Captain Lewis, to his credit, adapted quickly once he understood the intelligence picture, offering insights on team capabilities that strengthened the revised approach. Within 20 minutes, we had completely restructured Operation Ridgeline around the reality of what our teams would actually face rather than what yesterday's planning had assumed. As the new orders were transmitted to field units, General Harrington remained a silent presence at the edge of the command console, watching but not interfering. At precisely 0700 hours, Operation Ridgeline commenced under the revised parameters. From my position at Central Command, I tracked team movements with the focused intensity that had become second nature over 15 years of similar operations. The opposing force, expecting our teams to appear from the north, had positioned their primary assets to intercept a threat that never materialized. Instead, our units approached from the south, using the morning fog bank as natural concealment, bypassing observation posts that would have compromised the original plan. Within the first 30 minutes, it became clear that we had completely reversed the tactical advantage. What had been set up as an ambush was now unfolding as a textbook demonstration of surprise and initiative. "Command, Team Alpha has reached the first checkpoint," Captain Lewis reported, his voice crackling through the comm system. "No contact with opposing forces. Proceeding to objective as directed." I acknowledged the update with a quick, "Copy that, Alpha," while monitoring the tactical display. The revised operation was proceeding precisely as planned. Teams were moving efficiently through terrain that the original plan would have avoided, maintaining stealth while achieving their objectives at an accelerated pace. Around me, the command center had transformed. The dismissive glances had been replaced by focused attention. Officers who had barely acknowledged my presence yesterday were now hanging on every tactical adjustment I made. Even Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, initially rigid with discomfort, had begun nodding along as the operation's success became increasingly evident. General Harrington observed it all from his position near the back wall, his expression revealing nothing as he watched both the tactical displays and the personnel monitoring them. His presence had altered the room's dynamics in ways that went beyond the change in command structure. When a general unexpectedly appears and rearranges operational leadership, people start questioning everything they thought they knew. Team Bravo reporting defensive position at grid coordinate 045872, came another update. Appears recently abandoned. Signs suggest they relocated within the last hour. "Copy, Bravo," I responded. "Proceed with caution. They're likely repositioning to counter what they believe is our northern approach." The tactical map showed exactly what I'd predicted. The opposing force had committed their resources to counter the original plan, leaving themselves vulnerable to our adjusted approach. What would have been a devastating ambush was now becoming a strategic failure for the opposition. At the 90-minute mark, Captain Reynolds from Team Charlie reported, "Command, we have eyes on the primary objective. Opposition appears minimal. Request permission to proceed with seizure operation." "Granted, Charlie," I replied. "But maintain security protocols. This is going too smoothly." Something about the situation didn't feel right. Military operations rarely unfolded without complications, especially against an adaptive opposing force. I studied the satellite feeds again, looking for what I might be missing. There is a subtle movement pattern in the eastern sector, just beyond the primary objective. Heat signatures indicating a small force positioning themselves, where they could observe the objective without being immediately obvious. "All teams be advised," I said, my voice sharp with urgency. "Possible observation post established east of the primary objective. Appears to be a counter-ambush position." Captain Lewis's response was immediate, his earlier skepticism apparently forgotten. "Copy, Command. Adjusting approach vector to incorporate eastern security elements." What happened next vindicated every concern I'd raised in the planning sessions. As Team Charlie approached the objective from their revised angle, they spotted the counter-ambush force that would have caught them completely exposed under the original plan, or even under our first revision. Instead of walking into a trap, our teams now held the tactical advantage. "Command, this is Charlie," Reynolds reported 15 minutes later. "Primary objective secured. Opposition force neutralized with minimal simulated casualties. Mission objectives achieved." The command center erupted in the controlled celebration that follows successful operations, not cheering or high fives, but the relaxed postures and satisfied nods of professionals who've just witnessed textbook execution. I maintained my focus on the tactical displays, ensuring all teams maintained security until the exercise was officially concluded. "All units maintain tactical positioning," I instructed. "Operation concludes only when all elements are accounted for and secured." It was a standard precaution, but one that too many commanders neglected during training exercises, creating bad habits that could prove fatal in actual combat situations. Around me, I could feel a shift in the atmosphere, respect replacing skepticism, acknowledgement replacing dismissal. When the final unit reported secure status and the exercise officially concluded, General Harrington approached the command console. His expression remained neutral, but there was a quality to his attention that suggested he'd been waiting for precisely this moment. "Excellent work, Major Ramsey," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for nearby personnel to hear. "I'd like to see you in the conference room in 15 minutes. Bring your operational notes." As he left, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson approached, his earlier rigidity replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like forced cordiality. "Well done, Major. The operation was successful." The reluctant acknowledgement might have been satisfying under different circumstances, vindication after days of dismissal. But 15 years in uniform had taught me that success in the military isn't about personal victories. It's about mission accomplishment and bringing everyone home safely. "Thank you, sir," I replied simply. The teams executed brilliantly once they had accurate intelligence. I gathered my materials with methodical precision, aware of the changed dynamics around me. Officers who had avoided eye contact now nodded respectfully as I passed. Captain Lewis, to his credit, approached directly. "Major Ramsey," he said, military formality barely concealing his discomfort. "Your tactical adjustments saved us from walking into a textbook ambush. I should have given more consideration to your intelligence assessment." "The intelligence is only valuable when it's properly integrated into operations, Captain," I replied. "Your execution once the plan changed was exemplary." He nodded, acknowledging both the compliment and the subtle reminder that tactical success required more than just confidence. It required adaptability and respect for intelligence that might contradict your assumptions. 15 minutes later, I entered the conference room where General Harrington waited, my operational notes organized with the same precision I applied to everything in my military career. The general stood by the window, looking out over the training grounds where teams were now conducting post-exercise recovery. "Close the door, Major," he said without turning around. I complied, then stood at parade rest, waiting. Military protocol dictated that junior officers speak only when addressed by senior officers, particularly those wearing stars on their shoulders. Harrington turned from the window, studying me with the evaluating gaze that had likely assessed thousands of officers during his decades of service. "You've been with the 5th Group for 3 weeks, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Transferred in on the 12th. And in that time, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson assigned you to. What was it? Communications oversight?" "Yes, sir." "And intelligence coordination?" Harrington nodded slowly. "Yet your service record indicates expertise in tactical planning and field operations leadership. Multiple commendations for operational excellence in theaters that don't appear in unclassified briefings." I remained silent. The general clearly already knew everything in my service record, including the classified portions that Lieutenant Colonel Jackson and Captain Lewis hadn't been cleared to see. "Tell me, Major," Harrington continued, "why didn't you push harder when your tactical assessment was dismissed? You could have gone up the chain of command. You could have insisted Jackson review the intelligence more thoroughly." The question wasn't accusatory, it was evaluative. The kind senior officers ask when they're assessing not just competence, but character. "Sir, military effectiveness requires cohesion and clear command structure," I answered. "Undermining Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's authority would have created division within the unit, regardless of whether my assessment was correct. So you were willing to watch a flawed operation proceed rather than challenge the established hierarchy?" "No, sir," I replied without hesitation. "I documented my concerns through appropriate channels, prepared contingency plans based on the intelligence available to me, and positioned myself to provide maximum support when the situation developed as predicted. My priority was mission success and personnel safety, not proving I was right." Harrington's expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture shifted slightly, approval, perhaps, or confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Your approach was correct, Major," he said finally. "Military effectiveness requires both respect for the chain of command and the moral courage to ensure mission success through whatever appropriate channels are available. You demonstrated both." He moved to the conference table, gesturing for me to take a seat. "What you may not know is that Operation Ridgeline wasn't just a standard training exercise. It was also an evaluation of this unit's capacity to integrate intelligence effectively into operational planning." I maintained a neutral expression, though the implication was clear. The entire scenario had been designed to test, not just tactical execution, but the command structure's willingness to adapt based on intelligence input. The opposing force was specifically instructed to anticipate the most likely approach routes, Harrington continued. They were given information that mirrored what your intelligence assessment identified. The exercise was designed to fail if the planning team dismissed accurate intelligence warnings, which is precisely what happened until this morning. "I understand, sir." Harrington studied me for a moment longer. "What's your assessment of the unit's overall performance, Major? Not just today's execution, but the entire planning process." It was a loaded question, an invitation to criticize superior officers to a general who could end careers with a single performance review. Military politics suggested a diplomatic answer, one that acknowledged success without highlighting the failures that preceded it. But military effectiveness required honesty, especially when addressing senior leadership. The unit demonstrated excellent tactical capability once provided with accurate intelligence integration. I began carefully. However, the planning process revealed significant vulnerabilities in how intelligence assessment is weighted against operational confidence. Had this been an actual combat operation rather than a training exercise, the initial plan would likely have resulted in substantial casualties. And the leadership dynamics? Another dangerous question. My response could either burn bridges permanently or fail to address systemic problems that put missions and lives at risk. "Sir, military units perform best when leadership evaluates input based on its merits rather than its source," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "When rank or background or gender becomes a filter that determines which expertise is valued, operational effectiveness suffers." Harrington nodded slowly. "That's been my experience as well, Major." He stood, signaling that our conversation was nearing its end. "I'll be making some adjustments to the command structure within 5th Group, Lieutenant. Colonel Jackson has strengths in administrative leadership, but today's exercise revealed deficiencies in his approach to tactical planning and intelligence integration." I remained silent. Whatever changes were coming would be determined at levels far above my position. Effective immediately, you'll be reassigned as Chief of Operations Planning, reporting directly to me until a permanent command restructuring is finalized, Harrington continued. Your first task will be conducting the comprehensive review of the unit's intelligence, integration protocols, and tactical planning procedures. The promotion was significant, a public acknowledgement that my expertise had been underutilized and that the dismissal I'd experienced had been contrary to military effectiveness. Thank you, sir. I'll begin immediately. Harrington moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Major. The military changes slowly, and not everyone adapts to those changes at the same pace. You'll continue to encounter resistance from officers who evaluate expertise based on outdated assumptions. I'm familiar with the challenge, sir. I'm sure you are, he replied. But remember this: competence speaks louder than rank, and results matter more than perception. You proved that today. Make sure you continue proving it in your new role. Understood, sir. As General Harrington left, I remained seated for a moment, processing the implications of what had just occurred. In a single morning, I'd gone from being the officer nobody wanted to hear from to a position where my expertise couldn't be ignored. The transition wasn't about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that missions succeeded and personnel returned safely, regardless of who received credit for the planning. When I finally left the conference room, the corridor outside had filled with personnel preparing for the afternoon's debriefing session. Conversations paused momentarily as I passed, the subtle shift in body language telling me that news of my reassignment had already begun circulating through the unit's informal communication channels. Captain Lewis approached, his earlier discomfort replaced by professional respect. Major Ramsey, the teams are assembled for the operation debriefing. General Harrington suggested you might want to lead the session, given the outcome. Thank you, Captain. I'll be there shortly. As I gathered my materials for the debriefing, I reflected on the path that had led to this moment. 15 years of proving myself in a system that often evaluated expertise through filters of gender and background. Countless briefings where I'd been the only woman in the room, my input dismissed until reality forced acknowledgement. Classified operations where lives depended on my analysis being taken seriously. The military was changing, but change came slowly and unevenly. For every General Harrington who evaluated officers based on competence rather than conformity, there were dozens of Lieutenant Colonel Jacksons who relied on outdated assumptions about who belonged in which roles. The debriefing room had filled completely by the time I arrived, with personnel standing along the back wall when seats ran out. The atmosphere was different from any previous session I'd attended with this unit. Focused attention rather than casual dismissal. Engaged professionalism rather than perfunctory participation. General Harrington sat at the back of the room, his presence ensuring that every officer present understood the significance of what had transpired during Operation Ridgeline. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson sat near the front, his expression carefully neutral as I took position at the briefing podium. Good afternoon, I began, surveying the assembled officers with the calm confidence that came from knowing exactly what I was talking about. Today's operation demonstrated both strengths and vulnerabilities in our tactical approach. We'll begin with a chronological breakdown of key decision points, followed by an analysis of how intelligence integration affected operational outcomes. For the next hour, I led the unit through a comprehensive assessment of what had gone right and wrong during Operation Ridgeline. I highlighted the excellent execution once plans had been adjusted, commended individual teams for their adaptability, and tactfully addressed the planning deficiencies that had nearly led to catastrophic failure. Throughout the session, I could feel the shift happening, the subtle rebalancing that occurs when expertise is finally acknowledged regardless of its source. Officers who had dismissed my input days earlier now took notes as I explained the intelligence patterns they'd overlooked. Team leaders who had avoided eye contact now engaged directly, asking questions that reflected genuine interest rather than obligatory participation. The key takeaway from today's exercise, I concluded, is that effective operations require seamless integration between intelligence assessment and tactical planning. When those elements operate in silos, with one subordinated to the other, we create vulnerabilities that adversaries can exploit. Our success depends not on whose idea prevails, but on how effectively we combine all available expertise to achieve mission objectives. As the debriefing concluded, General Harrington rose from his seat. Major Ramsey has been reassigned as Chief of Operations Planning, effective immediately, he announced. All tactical planning will be coordinated through her office, with appropriate input from field commanders and intelligence sections. I expect full cooperation from all personnel in implementing the procedural changes that will follow her review. The message couldn't have been clearer. The days of dismissing expertise based on rank or background were over, at least within this command. What mattered was competence, demonstrated through results rather than confidence. As officers filed out of the debriefing room, I noticed Martinez, a young lieutenant who had been with one of the field teams during the exercise. He approached hesitantly, glancing around as if concerned about being observed. "Major Ramsey," he said, keeping his voice low, "I just wanted to say, your adjustments to the operation plan probably saved half my team from being killed today. The original approach would have walked us straight into their observation posts." "That's what intelligence integration is supposed to do, Lieutenant," I replied. "Identify threats before they become casualties." He nodded, then added, "Some of us were wondering, is it true what they're saying? That you ran Spec Ops in Kandahar? That you were the one who coordinated the extraction in Helmand Province when the 10th Mountain got surrounded?" The operations he referenced were classified, though rumors always circulated among junior officers eager to piece together the unofficial histories of complex missions. I gave him the same neutral expression I perfected over 15 years of handling similar questions. "Focus on the lessons from today, Lieutenant. They'll serve you better than stories about past operations." He nodded, taking the non-answer as the only response he was likely to receive. "Yes, ma'am. Looking forward to working with you in the planning section." As Martinez left, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson approached, his expression a careful blend of professional courtesy and barely concealed discomfort. "Major Ramsey, General Harrington has asked me to ensure your transition to operations planning goes smoothly. Whatever resources you need will be made available." "Thank you, sir. I'll prepare a requirements list by tomorrow morning." Jackson hesitated, clearly struggling with what to say next. "I should acknowledge that your intelligence assessment was correct. The operation would have failed without your intervention." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was as close as military culture typically came to admitting error. I could have pressed the point, could have highlighted how his dismissal of my expertise had nearly compromised the entire operation. But 15 years in uniform had taught me that effectiveness came from looking forward, not backward. "The important thing is that we've identified how to strengthen our planning process moving forward," I replied. "Integration works better than segregation when it comes to intelligence and operations." Jackson nodded stiffly. "General Harrington mentioned that you'll be conducting a comprehensive review of our planning procedures." "Yes, sir. I'll need access to the last 6 months of operation plans and after-action reports to establish baseline patterns." "You'll have everything you need," he said, though his tone suggested he understood exactly what the review would reveal about his command approach. "My office will cooperate fully." As Jackson walked away, I turned my attention to organizing the materials I'd need for my new role. The transition wouldn't be seamless. Nothing in military culture ever was. There would be resistance from officers accustomed to the old way of doing things. Skepticism from those who hadn't witnessed today's demonstration of what happened when intelligence was properly integrated into operations. But something fundamental had shifted. General Harrington's directive that nobody moves without Major Ramsey's approval had done more than just alter the command structure for a single training exercise. It had sent a message throughout the entire unit. Expertise mattered more than perception. Competence outweighed conformity, and effectiveness required evaluating input based on its merits rather than its source. As I left the briefing room, I passed a group of junior officers huddled around the day's assessment scoreboard. The final tallies showed what the exercise controllers had calculated. Under the original plan, the operation would have failed with an estimated 70% casualty rate. Under the revised approach, it had succeeded with minimal losses. Numbers didn't lie, even when people did. Results spoke louder than rank or background or gender. And today, those results had finally given me a voice that couldn't be ignored. The next morning dawned with a crisp autumn chill that cut through my uniform as I walked across the compound. 3 weeks into my new role as Chief of Operations Planning, I'd already implemented sweeping changes to how the 5th Group approached mission preparation. My office, once a forgotten corner space barely large enough for a desk, had been relocated to the central planning hub, physical manifestation of General Harrington's directive to place intelligence integration at the core of our tactical approach. As I entered the operations center, the atmosphere was noticeably different from that first dismissive briefing. Junior officers straightened as I passed, not with the rigid discomfort of forced respect, but with the natural response to leadership they'd come to trust. The planning table, once dominated by Captain Lewis and his tactical confidence, now hosted a diverse team of officers whose expertise spanned intelligence analysis, field operations, communication security, and logistics. Major Ramsey, Lieutenant Chun called from her intelligence workstation. Satellite passes from 040 show significant movement in the training area. New defensive positions established along these ridgelines. She transferred the imagery to the main tactical display, highlighting changes that would have been dismissed as insignificant 3 weeks earlier. Good catch, I acknowledged, studying the patterns with practiced analysis. They're anticipating our standard approach vectors. Let's incorporate this into today's planning session. Captain Lewis entered, carrying the tactical manuals that had once been his primary reference for operational planning. The change in his demeanor over the past 3 weeks had been perhaps the most surprising development. Initial resentment had given way to reluctant cooperation, then to genuine professional engagement as he witnessed firsthand how integrated planning improved operational outcomes. "Morning, Major," he said, setting his materials beside mine on the planning table. "I reviewed the weather forecasts you requested. Low cloud ceiling expected during our operational window, which will limit aerial reconnaissance unless we adjust our timeline." "We'll need to account for that," I agreed. "Let's build primary and alternate timelines based on meteorological variables." The interaction was emblematic of how the unit had transformed, from dismissing intelligence input as theoretical concerns, to proactively integrating all available data into comprehensive planning. It hadn't been an easy transition. Military culture didn't change overnight, even with the general's directive forcing the issue. The first week had been particularly challenging. Officers accustomed to the old way of doing things had complied with the new protocols without embracing them, following the letter of my directives while missing their spirit. Reports were filed with technically complete information, but lacking substantive analysis. Meetings were attended with physical presence, but minimal engagement. I'd expected the resistance and planned accordingly. Rather than demanding immediate acceptance, I focused on demonstrating effectiveness. Each successful operation under the new protocols built credibility. Each avoided pitfall validated the approach. Results spoke louder than rank or tradition, and the results were increasingly difficult to dismiss. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson entered the operations center, his posture suggesting the uncomfortable position of a commander whose authority had been publicly circumvented. Though General Harrington had been diplomatic in restructuring the command relationships, everyone understood that Jackson's dismissal of intelligence concerns had necessitated the intervention. "Major Ramsey," he acknowledged, his tone professional but reserved. "I understand you've implemented significant changes to our planning procedures." "Yes, sir. The new protocols have improved our operational effectiveness by approximately 40% based on exercise metrics." Jackson nodded, unable to argue with numbers that had been independently verified by training evaluators. "General Harrington speaks highly of your approach. He suggested we consider implementing similar changes across other units." The acknowledgement was significant coming from an officer who had dismissed my input so completely just weeks earlier. Military careers were built on reputation, and Jackson was pragmatic enough to recognize which way the wind was blowing. If General Harrington valued intelligence integration, then intelligence integration suddenly mattered to officers concerned with advancement. "I'd be happy to prepare briefing materials outlining the protocols we've implemented," I offered, "with examples of how they've improved specific operations." "That would be—" Jackson hesitated, clearly searching for appropriate phrasing. "Helpful. General Harrington has called a command staff meeting at 1300 to discuss expanding your role within the group." As Jackson left, Martinez approached my planning station, his expression suggesting news he wasn't sure how to deliver. The young lieutenant had become something of an unofficial liaison between field teams and my planning section, bridging the gap between operational execution and intelligence coordination. "Major, there's something you should know," he said, keeping his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Some of the other officers have been discussing your background. There are rumors circulating about your previous assignments." I continued organizing materials for the upcoming planning session, my expression revealing nothing about how unsurprised I was by this development. Military culture thrived on information hierarchies. Who knew what about whom often determined informal power structures as significantly as rank determined formal ones. "Let me guess," I replied. "They've discovered that my service record includes classified operations they don't have clearance to know about, and they're speculating about what that might mean." Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "Something like that, ma'am. There's talk that you were part of a specialized intelligence unit that embedded with special operations teams. That you ran tactical planning for missions that never officially happened. People always look for stories, Lieutenant. It's human nature to create narratives when information is incomplete." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated, then added, "But they're treating you differently now. Even the officers who were most resistant to your changes have stopped questioning your authority." I considered his observation, recognizing the double-edged nature of the development. Respect based on mysterious background rather than demonstrated competence was hardly progress. It simply replaced one form of superficial evaluation with another. The goal wasn't to be respected because of whispered rumors about classified operations. It was to be effective because intelligence and tactical planning worked best when fully integrated. "The only thing that matters is mission success and bringing everyone home safely," I told him. "Everything else is just noise." Martinez nodded, though his expression suggested he understood more than he was saying. "Yes, ma'am. By the way," Captain Lewis asked, "me to inform you that he's revised the tactical approach for tomorrow's exercise based on your intelligence assessment. He said to tell you that he's prioritizing adaptability over traditional protocols." The message represented significant progress. Lewis had been the most vocal advocate for the way we've always done things, before Operation Ridgeline demonstrated the potentially catastrophic consequences of that approach. His willingness to revise established protocols based on intelligence input suggested the cultural shift was taking root beyond mere Compliance with General Harrington's directives. Thank you, Lieutenant. Please tell Captain Lewis I appreciate his initiative. As Martinez left, I turned my attention to the command staff. Meeting scheduled for 1300. General Harrington hadn't shared the agenda, but Jackson's comments suggested it involved expanding my role within the group, likely formalizing the changes that had been implemented on a provisional basis over the past 3 weeks. The operations center continued filling with personnel preparing for the day's activities. Intelligence analysts coordinated with tactical planners. Communications specialists integrated with logistics officers. The artificial silos that had once defined our planning process were dissolving, replaced by the kind of cross-functional coordination that characterized effective military operations. At precisely 12:45, I gathered my materials and headed toward the command conference room, giving myself the customary 15 minutes to prepare before any significant meeting. Military punctuality wasn't just about being on time. It was about being ready before time became a factor. The conference room was empty when I arrived, as expected. I arranged my briefing materials with methodical precision, organizing reference documents and performance metrics in the sequence most likely to support whatever discussion General Harrington intended to initiate. 15 years of military briefings had taught me that preparation often determined outcomes more significantly than presentation. Officers began arriving at 12:55, conversation dying as they entered a space already occupied. Captain Lewis nodded respectfully as he took his seat. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson entered with several senior staff officers, their expression suggesting they knew something I didn't about the meeting's purpose. At precisely 1300, General Harrington entered, followed by 2 officers I didn't recognize, a full colonel wearing the insignia of division headquarters, and a lieutenant colonel whose uniform patches identified her as part of the Joint Special Operations Command. Their presence elevated the meeting from routine command staff coordination to something with potentially broader implications. "As you were," Harrington said as officers began to rise. "We'll keep this brief and to the point." He took position at the head of the conference table, gesturing for the visiting officers to join him. For those who haven't met them, this is Colonel Richards from Division Headquarters and Lieutenant Colonel Matsuda from JSOC. They're here to observe how we've restructured our operational planning protocols over the past 3 weeks. The introduction confirmed what I'd suspected. This meeting was about more than just internal command dynamics. General Harrington continued, "Major Ramsey, I'd like you to brief Colonel Richards and Lieutenant Colonel Matsuda on the changes you've implemented since assuming your role as Chief of Operations Planning." I moved to the briefing position with the same calm efficiency that had become my professional signature, arranging materials that I'd prepared anticipating exactly this scenario. Military advancement often depended on being ready for opportunities that arose without warning. "Thank you, sir," I began, addressing General Harrington before turning my attention to the visiting officers. Over the past 3 weeks, we fundamentally restructured how 5th Group approaches operational planning, moving from segregated functional areas to integrated cross-disciplinary teams. For the next 20 minutes, I outlined the specific protocols we'd implemented, supporting each change with documented performance improvements from training exercises conducted under the new approach. The briefing was comprehensive without being excessive, focused on outcomes rather than processes, on effectiveness rather than innovation. Colonel Richards listened with the evaluative attention of someone assessing implications beyond the immediate presentation. These results are impressive, Major, particularly the reduction in simulated casualties and the improvement in objective achievement rates. Thank you, sir. The credit belongs to the teams who've embraced the integrated approach. They've demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Lieutenant Colonel Matsuda leaned forward slightly. What's been your greatest challenge in implementing these changes? The question was pointed, cutting directly to the heart of military cultural resistance. I considered my response carefully, aware that my answer would reflect not just on me, but on the entire unit, including officers who had initially resisted the new protocols. The greatest challenge has been balancing respect for established expertise with the need for comprehensive intelligence integration, I replied. Our operators have extensive field experience that can't be replaced by analytical models, while our intelligence personnel have access to information that can fundamentally alter tactical calculations. The challenge wasn't convincing either group that the other had value. It was creating systems where that value could be leveraged most effectively. Matsuda nodded, seemingly satisfied with the diplomatic response that acknowledged challenges without assigning blame. General Harrington resumed control of the meeting with a directness that suggested we were approaching its true purpose. 3 weeks ago, I intervened in Operation Ridgeline because I observed a systematic failure to integrate critical intelligence into tactical planning, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. What could have been a catastrophic outcome in a real-world scenario was prevented only because Major Ramsey followed proper protocols despite being dismissed at every turn. The room had gone completely silent, officers shifting uncomfortably as Harrington articulated what everyone knew, but few would acknowledge directly. The changes Major Ramsey has implemented aren't optional, and they aren't temporary, he continued. They represent the standard by which this unit will operate moving forward. Colonel Richards and Lieutenant Colonel Matsuda are here because Division Headquarters and JSOC have taken notice of the improved performance metrics under the new protocols. He turned toward me. Major Ramsey, effective immediately, you're being promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and permanently assigned as Deputy Commander for Operations, reporting directly to me. Your responsibilities will include overseeing all operational planning and intelligence integration for 5th Group, with authority to implement these protocols across all subordinate units. The promotion was significant, a full rank advancement outside the normal cycle, with command authority that typically required years of additional service. Around the table, expressions ranged from surprise to respect to carefully concealed resentment. Thank you, sir, I acknowledged, maintaining the professional composure that had carried me through 15 years of being underestimated and overlooked. I'm honored by the confidence you've placed in me. Colonel Richards spoke next, his tone suggesting this development had been coordinated well before today's meeting. Division Headquarters has been monitoring the performance improvements demonstrated by 5th Group over the past 3 weeks. General Harrington's assessment of your leadership potential has been confirmed by the operational metrics. Your promotion has been approved at the highest levels. Lieutenant Colonel Matsuda added, JSOC is particularly interested in your integrated planning approach, Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey. We'll be sending personnel to observe your methodologies with an eye toward implementing similar protocols across other special operations units. The implications extended far beyond a personal promotion or expanded command authority. This was about changing how military operations were planned and executed, at a systemic level about ensuring that intelligence wasn't just a supporting function but an integral component of tactical decision-making. As the meeting concluded, officers approached to offer congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity. Captain Lewis, surprisingly, seemed genuinely pleased by the development. Congratulations, Colonel, he said, using my new rank with a respect that would have been unimaginable 3 weeks earlier. Your approach has made us better operators. I've learned more about effective planning in 3 weeks than in my previous 3 years. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's congratulations were more reserved, his expression suggesting he was still processing the implications for his own command position. Congratulations on your promotion. I look forward to supporting your expanded role within the group. General Harrington approached as the room cleared, waiting until we were alone before addressing me directly. You've exceeded expectations, Lieutenant Colonel. Your approach to the challenges you faced demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we need at higher command levels. Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity to implement these changes more broadly. Harrington studied me with the evaluative gaze that had likely assessed thousands of officers during his career. You know why I was observing Operation Ridgeline that day? I assumed you received reports about the planning concerns, sir. I received a classified communication through channels that don't officially exist, he corrected. A message from someone who identified systematic failures in intelligence integration and predicted exactly how the operation would fail if those failures weren't addressed. The implication was clear: someone with access to highly restricted communication channels had drawn his attention to the situation unfolding within Fifth Group, someone who recognized the potentially catastrophic consequences of dismissing intelligence warnings based on who delivered them rather than what they contained. Whoever sent that message demonstrated considerable insight into operational vulnerabilities, I replied carefully. Harrington's expression suggested he understood exactly what wasn't being said. Indeed. The source also included a comprehensive analysis of how those vulnerabilities could be addressed through structural changes to the planning process, changes remarkably similar to those you've implemented over the past 3 weeks. I maintained the neutral expression that had become second nature when discussing sensitive matters. Effective solutions often follow similar patterns, sir. Indeed they do, he agreed. Particularly when developed by individuals with experience in operations that don't appear in unclassified briefings. The conversation had entered territory typically avoided in official settings, acknowledgement of classified backgrounds and communications channels that existed outside normal military protocols. Harrington seemed to recognize this, shifting back to more formal ground. Your promotion ceremony will be conducted tomorrow at 0900. Division Commander General Martinez will preside, which should tell you something about how your efforts here are being viewed at higher levels. I'll be prepared, sir. As General Harrington left, I remained in the conference room for a moment, processing the implications of what had just occurred. In 3 weeks, I'd gone from being marginalized as a communications oversight officer to being promoted and placed in command authority over the very officers who had dismissed my expertise. The transformation wasn't about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that military operations integrated all available expertise, regardless of its source. When I finally left the conference room, the operations center had returned to its normal rhythm of activity. Officers coordinated tactical planning with intelligence analysis. Communication specialists integrated with logistics officers. The artificial silos that had once defined our approach had dissolved, replaced by the kind of cross-functional coordination that characterized effective military operations. Martinez waited near my office, his expression suggesting news he was eager to share. "Colonel Ramsey," he said, using my new rank with evident satisfaction. Congratulations on your promotion. Word is spreading fast. Thank you, Lieutenant. Military news travels at the speed of light. Yes, ma'am. He hesitated, then added, There's something else you should know. The officers who were dismissing your input 3 weeks ago, they're now the ones telling new personnel about your background. The stories are getting more elaborate with each retelling. I couldn't help smiling at the irony. Military culture thrived on mythology stories of exceptional leaders, whose backgrounds contained classified chapters that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The same officers who had dismissed me based on superficial assessment were now creating narratives to explain why they should have recognized my expertise from the beginning. Let them tell their stories, Lieutenant. What matters is that we continue improving our operational effectiveness. As Martinez left, I turned my attention to the work that remained, implementing protocols that would ensure intelligence. Integration became standard practice rather than exceptional intervention. The promotion and expanded authority were significant, but they were means rather than ends. The goal wasn't advancement or recognition. It was ensuring that operations succeeded and personnel returned safely. The next morning, as I prepared for the promotion ceremony, I reflected on the path that had led to this moment. 15 years of proving myself in a system that often evaluated expertise through filters of background and gender. Countless briefings where I'd been the only woman in the room, my input dismissed until reality forced acknowledgement. Classified operations where lives depended on my analysis being taken seriously. The military was changing, but change came unevenly and often reluctantly. For every General Harrington who evaluated officers based on competence rather than conformity, there were dozens of others who relied on outdated assumptions about who belonged in which roles. Progress wasn't measured in policies or promotions, but in the daily reality of whose expertise was valued when critical decisions were made. As I adjusted my uniform one final time before heading to the ceremony, I remembered Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's dismissive comment from that first planning session. Intelligence support is important, but it's not command authority. 3 weeks later, I'd been promoted to his rank and given authority that encompassed his role. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was the responsibility that came with it, to ensure that the changes implemented under my leadership became permanent, features of how military operations were planned and executed. To create systems where expertise was evaluated based on its merit rather than its source. To build a military culture where nobody moves without her approval wasn't an exceptional intervention but standard practice when that approval was backed by demonstrated competence. The formation ground was filled when I arrived. Personnel assembled in parade formation with General Martinez and his staff positioned at the reviewing stand. As I approached, I noticed something unexpected. Officers from units beyond 5th Group had gathered to observe the ceremony, their presence suggesting that word had spread about the changes being implemented under my leadership. General Harrington met me at the edge of the formation ground, his expression suggesting satisfaction with how events had unfolded. "Ready, Lieutenant Colonel?" "Yes, sir." "Good, because after today, your work really begins. Changing protocols is relatively easy. Changing culture, that's the real challenge." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The promotion was significant, but it was just one step in a much longer journey. The real measure of success would be whether the changes we'd implemented outlasted any individual leader, whether they became so embedded in military culture that no one could remember operating any other way. As we moved toward the formation, I caught sight of Captain Lewis standing with his tactical team, his expression suggesting he'd come to terms with the new reality. Beside him, Martinez watched with evident satisfaction, as if witnessing the conclusion of a story he'd always believed would end this way. Even Lieutenant Colonel Jackson stood at attention, his posture reflecting the professional respect required by military protocol, if not personal conviction. The path forward wouldn't be easy. Change never was, especially in institutions built on tradition and hierarchy. But as General Martinez called the formation to attention and prepared to administer the oath that would formalize my promotion, I recognized that each step forward created space for others to follow. Each barrier broken made the next one easier to overcome. Nobody moves without her approval. 3 weeks ago, those words had been an extraordinary intervention by a general officer addressing the systemic failure. Today, they were becoming standard practice in a unit that had learned sometimes painfully that effective operations required respecting expertise regardless of its source. And tomorrow? Tomorrow they might just become the foundation for a military culture where such interventions were no longer necessary because competence spoke louder than rank. Results mattered more than perception, and expertise was valued based on its merit rather than its messenger. 6 months after my promotion, I stood at the edge of the training ground, watching the culmination of what we'd built. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Kentucky landscape as teams executed a complex joint operation that would have been impossible under the old approach. Intelligence and operations moved in perfect synchronization, each element adapting to new information with the fluid precision that comes only from complete integration. Impressive, isn't it? General Harrington said, joining me at the observation point. They're operating at a level that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. I nodded, watching as Team Alpha adjusted their approach route based on real-time intelligence updates without breaking stride or requiring command authorization. The seamless coordination between intelligence analysis and tactical execution had become so embedded in our operational culture that it now seemed obvious, as if no one could imagine doing things any other way. The change happened faster than I expected, I admitted. I thought we'd face more resistance. Results are persuasive, Lieutenant Colonel, Harrington replied. When operators see their effectiveness improve and their casualty rates drop, even the most traditional minds start reconsidering their assumptions. The metrics told a compelling story. Since implementing the integrated planning protocols, 5th Group had achieved a 62% improvement in operational effectiveness during training exercises. Simulated casualty rates had dropped by 78%. Mission completion times had decreased by 35%, while objective achievement rates had climbed to nearly 100%. But numbers only captured part of the transformation. The real change was cultural, visible in how teams now operated as unified entities rather than segregated specialties. How intelligence wasn't just consulted, but integrated into every phase of planning and execution. How officers who had once dismissed analytical input now sought it out before finalizing any operational approach. We've received requests from 6 other units to observe our protocols, I noted, watching as Team Bravo executed a perfect breach maneuver based on intelligence that had been updated just moments earlier. Division is considering implementing similar changes across all operational groups. Harrington nodded, unsurprised by the development. That's how transformation works in the military. First, they ignore you. Then they resist you. Then they ask to observe your methods. Finally, they claim they've always done it that way. His observation captured the pattern I'd seen play out countless times over my 15-year career. Military culture changed slowly, then suddenly with long periods of resistance followed by rapid adoption once results became impossible to dismiss. Colonel Richards is arriving tomorrow to discuss expanding your role, Harrington continued. There's talk at Division about creating a formal doctrinal approach based on your protocols, with you leading the implementation across multiple units. The prospect represented a significant expansion of influence, from changing how one group operated to potentially transforming how the entire division approached operational planning. It was the kind of opportunity that could shape military effectiveness for decades to come. "I'll prepare a comprehensive briefing on our implementation metrics," I replied, with emphasis on how the protocols can be adapted for different operational contexts. As we watched the exercise unfold, Captain Lewis approached from the command post, his tablet displaying the real-time operational feed. In the 6 months since my promotion, he'd become one of the strongest advocates for the integrated planning approach or transformation, as surprising as it was complete. "Colonel Ramsey," he acknowledged, "Team Charlie is requesting your input on their approach to the secondary objective. The opposing force has adapted their defensive posture in a pattern we haven't encountered before." The request represented perhaps the most significant cultural shift of all. 6 months ago, tactical teams would have proceeded based on predetermined plans, regardless of changing conditions. Now they actively sought intelligence integration when facing unfamiliar scenarios, valuing adaptability over rigid adherence to established protocols. "I'll review their situation immediately," I replied, following Lewis to the Tactical Operations Center, where real-time feeds displayed the evolving scenario. The Operations Center had transformed as significantly as our planning processes. Where separate stations had once reinforced functional silos, the space had been reconfigured to facilitate constant coordination. Intelligence analysts worked directly alongside tactical planners. Communications specialists integrated seamlessly with logistics officers. The physical layout now reflected the integrated approach we'd implemented at every level. Lieutenant Chun, who had risen quickly to become our lead intelligence coordinator, greeted me as I entered. "Colonel, Team Charlie encountered an unusual defensive pattern at grid reference 073 to 452. The opposing force appears to be implementing a multi-layered security approach we haven't seen in previous exercises." I studied the tactical display, noting the subtle but significant differences from established patterns. They're adapting to our integrated approach, implementing their own version of cross-functional coordination. The development was both challenging and encouraging evidence that our methods had become so effective that opposing forces were being forced to evolve their own tactics in response. It created precisely the kind of adaptive environment that prepared units for real-world operations against adversaries who constantly changed their approaches. "Relay to Team Charlie. Maintain current position and establish observation points here, here, and here," I instructed, marking coordinates on the tactical display. The opposing force is likely attempting to draw them into a channelized approach, where their multi-layered defense would be most effective. Instead, we'll implement a dispersed infiltration pattern that negates their defensive concentration. The instructions were transmitted immediately, Team Charlie acknowledging with professional efficiency as they adjusted their approach based on the updated intelligence assessment. Within minutes, they had repositioned according to the new plan, bypassing the defensive concentration that would have significantly complicated their mission under the original approach. "Excellent adaptation, Colonel," General Harrington observed, having followed us into the operations center. "That's exactly the kind of real-time integration we've been working toward." The exercise continued for another 2 hours, with each team demonstrating the adaptive coordination that had become our operational signature. When the final objective was secured and the exercise concluded, the performance metrics confirmed what we'd observed directly: the highest effectiveness rating ever recorded for a joint training operation at Fort Campbell. As the teams returned for debriefing, I noticed Martinez, now captain, Martinez, after a well-deserved promotion, approaching with an expression that suggested news beyond the successful exercise. "Colonel Ramsey," he said, maintaining formal address despite the familiarity that had developed over the past 6 months. "There's something you should see before the debriefing." He handed me a tablet displaying internal communication traffic from Division Headquarters message is not intended for general distribution, but accessible to officers with appropriate security clearance. The communication contained a draft operations directive that would formalize our integrated planning protocols as standard doctrine across all subordinate units, with specific reference to the leadership that had developed and implemented the approach. "They're calling it the Ramsey Protocol," Martinez said, unable to contain a note of pride in his voice. The directive cites the performance metrics from our unit as justification for division-wide implementation. The development was significant beyond personal recognition. Military doctrine evolved slowly, with changes typically requiring years of validation before being formally adopted. The rapid acceptance of our integrated approach represented acknowledgement at the highest levels that the traditional segregation between intelligence analysis and tactical planning had become outdated. In an era of rapid adaptation and complex threats, "This is about more than just our unit," I replied, scanning the detailed implementation guidance that would extend our protocols far beyond 5th Group. "It's about ensuring that every operation benefits from complete intelligence integration, regardless of who's in command or what branch is involved." Martinez nodded, understanding the broader implications. "6 months ago, they were dismissing your input as theoretical concerns. Now they're building doctrine around your approach." The observation captured the irony of military cultural change, how resistance inevitably gave way to acceptance once results became impossible to ignore. How innovations initially dismissed as challenges to tradition eventually became traditions themselves. How leadership that once seemed disruptive eventually defined new standards of excellence. As we entered the debriefing room, I was struck by how completely the atmosphere had transformed from that first dismissive planning session 6 months earlier. Officers who had once avoided eye contact now engaged directly, seeking input rather than deflecting it. Teams that had once operated in isolated specialties now coordinated seamlessly across functional boundaries. The entire unit had transformed from a collection of segregated experts into an integrated operational entity. General Harrington opened the session with characteristic directness. "Today's exercise demonstrated the highest performance metrics we've recorded in any joint operation at this facility. The integrated planning approach pioneered by Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey has proven its effectiveness beyond any reasonable doubt." He gestured toward me. "Colonel Richards arrives tomorrow to discuss division-wide implementation of these protocols. I've asked Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey to prepare a comprehensive briefing on our approach, with emphasis on how the protocols can be adapted for different operational contexts." The announcement confirmed what Martinez's intelligence had already indicated: our methods were being elevated from unit-specific innovations to division-wide doctrine, with implications that would extend throughout the entire branch if the implementation proved as successful at scale as it had within 5th Group. I rose to address the assembled officers, aware that many of them had been present for that first contentious planning session, when my input had been dismissed without consideration. "The success we've achieved over the past 6 months belongs to everyone in this room," I began, acknowledging the collective effort that had transformed theoretical protocols into operational reality. What began as a change in planning procedures has become a fundamental shift in how we approach operations at every level. The debriefing continued with team leaders reporting on specific aspects of the exercise, each highlighting how integrated intelligence had improved their tactical execution. Captain Lewis, once the most vocal defender of traditional approaches, now spoke with conviction about how real-time intelligence integration had allowed his team to adapt to rapidly changing conditions that would have compromised mission success under the old methodology. As the session concluded, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson approached, his demeanor reflecting the complex position of a commander whose initial resistance had been proven definitively misguided. 6 months of unambiguous performance metrics had left no room for continued skepticism about the integrated approach. "Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey," he acknowledged, using my rank with the professional respect that had gradually replaced initial resistance. "Division Headquarters has requested that I provide a formal assessment of how the integrated protocols have affected unit performance. I wanted to let you know that my report will be unequivocally positive." The acknowledgement represented significant personal growth from an officer whose initial dismissal had necessitated General Harrington's intervention. Military careers were built on reputation, and publicly acknowledging a fundamental change in perspective required genuine professional courage. "Thank you, sir," I replied. The success of these protocols has always depended on having commanders willing to adapt their approaches based on operational realities rather than established traditions. Jackson nodded, recognizing both the acknowledgement of his evolution and the subtle reminder of his initial resistance. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from being proven wrong, Colonel. You've changed how this entire unit approaches operations, and we're better for it." As officers dispersed following the debriefing, General Harrington and I remained to discuss preparations for Colonel Richards's arrival the following day. The meeting would determine how broadly our integrated protocols would be implemented across the division, potentially affecting thousands of personnel. As the first concluded, Colonel Richards addressed the room directly. "Based on the performance metrics documented over the past 6 months, Division Headquarters has approved formal adoption of these protocols as standard doctrine for all operational units. Effective immediately, these procedures will be implemented division-wide under the designation Integrated Tactical Planning Protocol." He turned toward me. "Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey will oversee the implementation process across all subordinate units, with authority to adjust procedures as necessary to accommodate different operational contexts. All unit commanders will ensure their personnel are fully trained in these protocols within 90 days. The directive formalized what Martinez's intelligence had already indicated. Our methods were becoming standard doctrine, with implementation authority that extended far beyond 5th Group. What had begun as a disputed approach during a single training exercise was now transforming how an entire division approached operational planning. As the briefing concluded, officers approached with questions about specific aspects of the implementation process. Captain Lewis, who had become one of the strongest advocates for our approach, helped address tactical integration concerns from commanders who were encountering the protocols for the first time. Lieutenant Chun coordinated with intelligence officers from other units, explaining the analytical methodologies that supported real-time operational adjustment. The transformation wasn't just in procedures, but in people officers who had once dismissed intelligence integration, now championing its adoption. Teams that had once operated in isolated specialties, now demonstrating the benefits of cross-functional coordination. The cultural shift had become self-sustaining, with those who had experienced its benefits becoming its most effective advocates. Colonel Richards approached as the room gradually cleared, his expression suggesting satisfaction with how the briefing had unfolded. "Impressive presentation, Lieutenant Colonel. You've made a compelling case for division-wide implementation." "Thank you, sir. The performance metrics speak for themselves." "They do," he agreed. "But metrics alone don't change military culture. That requires leadership willing to challenge established practices when they no longer serve operational effectiveness." He studied me with the evaluative attention characteristic of senior officers, assessing potential for higher command. "General Harrington tells me you'll be up for full colonel within the year, with potential for brigade command if the division-wide implementation proves as successful as your work with 5th Group." The advancement timeline was accelerated beyond normal progression, a recognition that the impact of the Integrated protocols justified breaking with traditional career patterns. Military leadership valued results above all else, even when those results came through approaches that initially faced significant resistance. My focus is on ensuring successful implementation across all units, sir, I replied. The protocols work regardless of who's leading them, as long as they're applied consistently. Richards nodded approvingly. That's exactly why Division Headquarters has such confidence in your approach, Lieutenant Colonel. You've consistently emphasized effectiveness over attribution, results over recognition. As the meeting concluded and personnel dispersed to their assigned duties, I remained in the briefing room, reflecting on the transformation that had unfolded over the past 6 months. The journey from being overlooked in formation to implementing division-wide doctrine represented more than personal advancement. It demonstrated how military culture could evolve when effectiveness was prioritized over tradition, when expertise was valued regardless of its source. General Harrington returned as I gathered my briefing materials, his expression suggesting satisfaction with how events had unfolded. Division-wide implementation will be your legacy, Lieutenant Colonel. Long after you've moved to higher command positions, these protocols will continue shaping how operations are conducted throughout the entire branch. The observation captured the essence of genuine military leadership, creating systems that outlasted individual personalities, establishing methodologies that improved effectiveness regardless of who implemented them, building approaches that became so embedded in operational culture that no one could remember doing things any other way. That's the measure that matters, sir, I replied. Not who gets credit for the innovation, but how many operations succeed and how many personnel return safely because of improved methods. As we left the briefing facility, I noticed Martinez waiting near the entrance, his expression suggesting news he was eager to share. "Colonel," he said as we approached, "the first implementation teams have already been assigned. Units across the division are requesting briefings on the protocols ahead of the formal timeline." The development confirmed what we'd already observed within 5th Group once results became impossible to ignore. Resistance gave way to enthusiasm, skepticism transformed into advocacy, and what had been seen as disruptive innovation became recognized as essential improvement. Make sure they understand this isn't about replacing tactical expertise with intelligence analysis, I instructed. It's about ensuring both elements work together seamlessly at every stage of operations. Martinez nodded, having internalized the core principle that had guided our approach from the beginning. Integration over segregation, coordination over competition, effectiveness over tradition. As he left to coordinate with the implementation teams, I turned toward the training grounds where 5th Group was preparing for the next day's operations. From this vantage point, I could see teams moving with the synchronized precision that comes only when intelligence and tactics function as unified elements rather than segregated specialties. 6 months ago, they had passed over my rank at formation, dismissing expertise that didn't conform to their expectations of what leadership should look like. Today, nothing moved without my approval, not because of intervention from above, but because results had proven the effectiveness of an approach that prioritized integration over tradition, competence over conformity, and mission success over personal recognition. The transformation hadn't happened because someone in authority had mandated it. It had happened because effectiveness was ultimately more persuasive than resistance, because results spoke louder than rank or background or gender, because competence eventually overcame even the most entrenched skepticism. As I watched the teams execute maneuvers that would have been impossible under the old segregated approach, I recognized that the true measure of leadership isn't found in promotions or recognition, but in creating systems that outlast your direct involvement methods, that become so embedded in organizational culture that no one remembers a time before they existed. They had passed over my rank at formation, dismissing expertise that didn't conform to their preconceptions. Then the admiral had said, Nobody moves without her approval. And now, 6 months later, that extraordinary intervention had become standard doctrine, with implications that would shape military effectiveness for decades to come. The journey wasn't about personal vindication or individual advancement. It was about ensuring that every operation had the best possible chance of success, that every team had access to the intelligence they needed when they needed it, that every mission integrated all available expertise regardless of its source. Because in the end, that's what truly matters, not who gets credit for the innovation, but how many missions succeed and how many personnel return safely because methods improved. Approaches evolved, and expertise was valued based on its merit rather than its messenger. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.